It started with a single gunshot. A deafening crack in the silence of the night. Then, nothing. Just heavy breathing. A trembling hand clutching the phone. A man struggling to find the words. I shot her. David Turner was in shock. His voice was hollow, almost unrecognizable as he spoke to the 911 operator. On the floor, Rebecca, his wife, lay motionless, blood pooling around her. But she wasn't gone. Not yet. She was still moving. David, please? A whisper. A plea. But was it guilt? Or was it regret? David's grip tightened around the phone, his mind racing back to the moment that shattered his world. The doctor's words echoed in his head, cold, clinical, undeniable. You've tested positive for HIV. Impossible. He had only ever been with one woman. His wife. And then the truth. The confessions. The betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. She killed me first. His voice was barely above a whisper now, but the weight of those words was heavier than the crime itself. Outside, sirens wailed, flashing red and blue against the darkened windows. The walls of their home, once filled with love, now held only echoes of heartbreak and rage. The police were here. Drop the weapon. Hands where we can see them. Pause. A breath. The sound of metal clattering to the ground. David didn't resist. He didn't run. He just stood there, staring at the woman he once loved. The woman who had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. As the officers moved in, Rebecca's body went still. The house fell into silence. And as David was led away, his final words hung in the air like a ghost. She killed me first. David and Rebecca Turner were the kind of couple people admired. They had it all. A beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood, successful careers, and a love story that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. To their friends, they were the definition of perfection. The couple who finished each other's sentences, who hosted elegant dinner parties, who never raised their voices in public. David was a financial analyst, meticulous, disciplined, a man who prided himself on control. His life was a series of carefully calculated steps, from the crisp suits he wore to the strict schedule he followed. Rebecca, on the other hand, was his opposite in all the right ways. She was warm, spontaneous, the life of every gathering. A nurse by profession, she had a gift for making people feel at ease. She knew how to soften David's sharp edges, how to turn his quiet moments into laughter. They had been together for nearly a decade. 10 years of anniversaries, vacations, shared dreams. 10 years of believing in the illusion of forever. But behind closed doors, beneath the carefully curated smiles, there were cracks in the foundation. Small, almost invisible at first, but growing, spreading like fractures in glass. David noticed it before he ever admitted it to himself. It was in the way Rebecca had started pulling away, subtle, almost imperceptible. She still smiled, still kissed him goodbye in the mornings, still said, "I love you" before bed. But there was something missing. Something distant in her eyes when he spoke. There were late-night shifts at the hospital that seemed to stretch longer than usual. Text messages she quickly swiped away when he walked into the room. A scent on her skin, faint, unfamiliar. David had always trusted her. Had always believed in their love. But now, doubt began creeping in, an unwelcome intruder in their marriage. It wasn't just her behavior that changed. It was the way she looked at him. Like he was someone she pitied. Like she was carrying a secret too heavy to share. One night, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, David finally spoke the words that had been gnawing at his mind for months. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Rebecca barely looked up from her plate. She took a sip of wine, twirling the stem of the glass between her fingers. "David, please. Not this again." "Not what again?" His voice was calm, measured, but his grip on the fork tightened. "This, questioning. I've been working late, I've been tired, and now you're making it seem like there's something wrong with us." David studied her. The way she refused to meet his gaze. The way she dismissed his concerns with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this conversation 100 times before. "I never said there was something wrong," he said carefully. "But you did." She exhaled sharply, pushing her plate away. "I don't want to fight." And just like that, the conversation was over. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers. Rebecca was changing. And he was losing her. Weeks passed and the distance between them grew. David tried to ignore it, to convince himself that it was just a rough patch, that all marriages had them. But the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. There were nights she didn't come home until the early hours of the morning. Excuses that felt flimsy, forced. And then, there was the phone call. A Saturday afternoon. David was working in his study when he heard Rebecca's phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. She wasn't home, and without thinking he glanced at the screen. No name. Just a number. And one message. Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. David's blood turned to ice. For a long moment he just stood there, the words burning into his mind. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone, scrolling up, his heart pounding against his ribs. Dozens of messages. Months' worth of hidden conversations. And pictures. His wife. In the arms of another man. The world around him blurred. His breathing grew shallow. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. But it was. Every text, every image, every whispered, "I miss you," was a knife to the gut. Rebecca had been lying to him. For how long? Had she ever stopped loving him? Had she ever loved him at all? The front door creaked open. Footsteps. The sound of keys hitting the counter. Rebecca was home. David stood frozen in the kitchen, phone in hand, the screen still illuminated with proof of her betrayal. She walked in, setting down a bag of groceries, oblivious to the storm brewing in front of her. "Hey babe," she said casually, flashing that same smile she had given him for years. A smile that suddenly felt like a lie. She moved toward him, about to kiss his cheek, then she saw his expression. She stopped. "David? What's wrong?" Silence. Then, he turned the phone around, letting her see everything. The color drained from her face. Her breath hitched. And in that moment David saw it. Not shock. Not confusion. Guilt. She knew. She had known. For months, maybe longer. She had been living this double life, coming home to him every night, lying to his face without hesitation. Rebecca swallowed hard, forcing a weak, trembling laugh. "David, it's not what you think." "Don't," he cut her off, his voice dangerously low. His hands clenched at his sides, his entire body rigid with the weight of betrayal. She reached for him. "I can explain." "Explain? Explain what, Rebecca?" She hesitated. Words failed her. And in that moment, David realized the truth. There was no explanation that would make this right. No excuse that would undo what she had done. The woman standing in front of him, the woman he had built a life with, trusted, cherished, had destroyed everything. Everything they were. Everything they could have been. And worst of all, she wasn't sorry. Not truly. Not in the way that mattered. David turned away, his mind spinning, his heart pounding against his ribs. The perfect marriage, the perfect love, had been nothing more than a beautiful, well-constructed lie. And soon that lie would cost them both everything. Rebecca Turner had always been a woman of many layers. To the outside world, she was the devoted wife, the caring nurse, the woman who had it all. But beneath that carefully crafted image was a secret she had spent months, maybe even years, hiding. It started small. A harmless distraction. A flirtatious text. A lingering glance. A rush of excitement that sent shivers down her spine in a way that David no longer did. She told herself it was nothing. But nothing soon became something. The first time it happened, she had felt guilty. After all, she was a married woman. A wife. A partner in a life she had chosen. But that guilt faded faster than she expected. Because with him, her secret lover, she felt alive. His name was Jason. A co-worker at the hospital. Young, charming, reckless. Everything David wasn't. She told herself it wasn't serious. That it was just an escape. But deep down she knew the truth. She was playing a dangerous game. At first she was careful. Deleting messages. Avoiding suspicion. Making sure David never noticed the change in her routine. But then she got comfortable. She started coming home later, claiming she was working extra shifts. Her perfume changed, stronger, more intoxicating, a scent that didn't belong to their bedroom. She would take late-night showers the moment she got home, washing away any trace of where she had been, of whose hands had touched her. David never questioned it. Not at first. That was the beauty of being married to a man who trusted her so blindly. But trust was a fragile thing. And Rebecca was about to break it in the worst way possible. There was something thrilling about sneaking around. The secrecy. The whispered conversations. The stolen kisses in empty hospital rooms. She had convinced herself that what David didn't know wouldn't hurt him. But secrets have a way of unraveling. And Rebecca had made a mistake. A fatal one. It had been a routine blood test, just a precaution. When the results came back, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Positive. HIV. The words on the paper blurred as panic set in. Oh, how could this have happened? She had always been careful. Or at least she thought she had. Her mind raced. Jason. Had he known? Had he lied? Her stomach twisted as she realized the horrifying truth. She wasn't the only one he had been with. And now, She wasn't the only one infected. For the first time in months, she looked at David and felt true fear. Because she knew what was coming. Eventually he would find out. Eventually the truth would surface. And when it did, there would be no escaping the consequences. So she did what she had always done best. She lied. She acted normal, pretending everything was fine, hoping that somehow, by some miracle, she could delay the inevitable. But secrets like this don't stay buried. And when David walked into their home with a medical report clutched in his trembling hands, she knew. The lie was over. The perfect marriage was shattered. And soon, someone would die because of it. David Turner had always been a man of routine. His life was structured, predictable, controlled. Wake up at 6 a.m. Shower. Breakfast. Work. Gym. Home. Dinner. Sleep. A cycle that rarely changed. A life that, for the most part, felt secure. But that security shattered the moment he walked into his doctor's office and heard the words that would change his life forever. It started with fatigue. At first, he chalked it up to stress. Long work hours, poor sleep, maybe even the strain of his marriage slowly unraveling. Then came the headaches. The weight loss. The strange, lingering flu that never quite went away. Rebecca, being a nurse, was the first to suggest he get checked. Just a routine test, she had said one night, stirring sugar into her tea. It's probably nothing. But there was something in her voice. A hesitation. A flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. At the time, David ignored it. He should have paid attention. The clinic was quiet that morning. David sat in the waiting room, tapping his fingers against his knee, impatient. The nurse had drawn his blood an hour ago, and now he was just waiting for the results, expecting them to confirm what he already believed. It was probably just exhaustion. Nothing serious. When the doctor finally stepped into the room, David immediately knew something was wrong. Dr. Patel was a seasoned professional, calm, composed, unshakable. But today there was a heaviness in his eyes, a careful weight to his words. David, he began, his voice even. I need you to stay calm. A slow, creeping unease spread through David's chest. What is it? He asked, his throat suddenly dry. The doctor exhaled, setting the test results on the desk between them. Your blood work came back positive for HIV. Silence. David's ears started ringing. The world around him blurred. That's not possible. His own voice sounded foreign. Dr. Patel folded his hands together, his expression unreadable. I know this is difficult to process, but the results are clear. We'll run further tests to confirm your viral load, but... No. David shook his head, gripping the arms of his chair. There has to be a mistake. I've only ever been with one woman. His mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. There was none. Rebecca. His stomach twisted. His heart pounded. No. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. David. The doctor's voice softened. You need to have a conversation with your wife. A conversation. David clenched his fists. He didn't need a conversation. He needed the truth. And deep down he already knew what that truth was. The drive home felt like a blur. The world outside the car windows moved in slow motion. Every red light, every passing car, every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his hands were shaking against the steering wheel. Rebecca's car was there. She was home. Good. He wanted answers. And he wanted them now. The moment David stepped inside, Rebecca greeted him with a soft smile, standing at the kitchen counter, pouring herself a glass of wine. Hey, you're home early. Casual. Carefree. Like nothing was wrong. Like she wasn't hiding the biggest betrayal of their marriage. David dropped the test results onto the counter between them. What is this? His voice was cold. Controlled. Rebecca glanced at the paper. Then she froze. David saw it immediately. The way her fingers tightened around the glass. The way her shoulders tensed. The way her breath hitched just slightly. That was all the confirmation he needed. David, don't lie to me. His voice was low, steady, but the anger beneath it simmered like a volcano ready to erupt. Rebecca swallowed. The silence stretched. Then finally she spoke. I didn't mean for this to happen. David let out a hollow laugh. You didn't mean to betray me? You didn't mean to destroy our marriage? You didn't mean to give me a disease that could kill me? Rebecca flinched. I thought I was being careful, she whispered. David slammed his fist against the counter, making her jump. Careful? Careful. If you were so careful, then why am I infected? Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes. But David didn't care. Not this time. Not after what she had done. How long, Rebecca? His voice dropped to a deadly calm. How long have you been lying to me? She hesitated. And in that hesitation he found his answer. Too long. Much too long. Rebecca wiped at her tears, her voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted to hurt you. David shook his head. You didn't just hurt me, Rebecca. You ruined me. The air between them was thick, suffocating. Everything they had built, every moment, every memory, was gone. Burned to the ground by her betrayal. David took a step back, running a hand over his face. He felt sick, disgusted, broken. You killed me before I ever pulled the trigger. Rebecca's eyes widened. David, please? But he was already walking away. His mind spiraled. His vision blurred. And somewhere deep in his chest, something dark and dangerous took root. The kind of pain that didn't just fade away. The kind of pain that made men do unforgivable things. The weight of betrayal was suffocating. David had spent years building a life with Rebecca, trusting her, loving her, believing in their marriage. But all of it had been a lie. And now, as he stood in their kitchen, the air thick with unspoken words, something inside him snapped. You killed me before I ever pulled the trigger. David's voice was quiet, but the words cut like a blade. Rebecca's breath hitched. Her eyes were wide, glistening with tears, but David saw through them now. Crocodile tears. Empty apologies. Nothing she said could undo what she had done. David, please, she whispered, reaching for him. But he recoiled, his body stiff with rage. Don't touch me. His voice was sharp, venomous. You don't get to touch me after this. Rebecca trembled. I never wanted to hurt you. David let out a cold, humorless laugh. But you did. You didn't just betray me, you destroyed me. You took my life and threw it away like it meant nothing. Rebecca shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. So you let me find out like this? His voice cracked, raw and filled with something beyond pain. It was rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. Rebecca flinched, pressing her back against the counter. David's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. His entire body shook as memories flashed before his eyes. The years they had spent together, the love they had shared, the quiet moments that once felt so real. But none of it had been real. Because the woman standing before him wasn't the woman he thought he knew. She was a stranger. A liar. A murderer. How long? His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. How long have you been sleeping with him? Rebecca's lips parted, but no words came out. Tell me. She flinched at his roar, her body trembling. Over a year, she finally admitted. A year. 12 months. 365 days. David felt sick. His stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat. How many times had she come home and kissed him after being in another man's arms? How many nights had she laid beside him, knowing she was bringing a death sentence into their bed? His vision blurred, his breathing ragged. The walls of their home, once warm, once filled with love, now felt like a cage. Was it worth it? He asked, voice shaking. Rebecca sobbed. I don't know. Wrong answer. David slammed his fist against the counter, making the glasses rattle. You don't know. Rebecca let out a choked sob, but David didn't care. Not anymore. He had spent years loving this woman, giving her everything. And in return she had given him a death sentence. Something dark crept into his mind. An idea. A solution. His eyes flicked to the drawer by the stove. Inside it, cold, heavy, deadly, was his father's old revolver. He had never needed it before. But tonight everything had changed. David's fingers twitched. His breathing slowed. Rebecca saw it. She saw the shift in his eyes, the way his rage settled into something even more terrifying. And she panicked. David, don't, she pleaded, shaking her head. Please, I love you. No. His voice was eerily calm now. You don't. She had never loved him. Because love doesn't betray. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't kill. David stepped toward the drawer. And in that moment Rebecca realized. She was about to pay for her sins. The kitchen was silent. The kind of silence that suffocates, that weighs heavy in the air like a storm about to break. David stood frozen, his fingers grazing the handle of the drawer. Inside, cold and unmoving, was the revolver. His father's gun. A relic from another time. A weapon he had never thought he would need, until now. Across from him, Rebecca was shaking. Tears streaked her face, her lips trembling as she whispered his name. David, please? But there was nothing left to say. Nothing left to save. David's mind was a blur, a chaotic whirlwind of pain, betrayal, and rage. This wasn't supposed to be his life. He had done everything right. Worked hard. Loved deeply. Built a future with the woman he thought he knew. And yet, here he was, standing in his own kitchen, infected, broken, seconds away from making a choice he could never undo. His fingers tightened around the drawer handle. Slowly he pulled it open. The gun gleamed under the dim kitchen light. Rebecca's breath hitched. David. He gripped the revolver. The weight of it felt foreign in his hands. Heavy. Solid. Final. Rebecca took a step back, pressing herself against the counter. Her entire body was trembling. You don't have to do this, she pleaded. Please. I know I hurt you, but we can fix this. David let out a hollow laugh, his grip tightening. Fix this. His voice was hoarse. You ruined everything, Rebecca. There is no fixing this. She shook her head violently. I didn't mean for this to happen. But it did. His voice cracked, raw with the weight of everything he had lost. Rebecca had taken everything from him. His love, his trust, his future. His life. And now he was left with nothing but a sickness that would follow him forever. Unless. David raised the gun. Rebecca let out a strangled sob, her hands trembling as she held them up in surrender. David, please? His heart pounded. His vision blurred. In this moment he had all the power. For once he wasn't the victim. For once he got to decide. His finger hovered over the trigger. One pull. One single movement and this would be over. His pain. His suffering. Her lies. Everything. Time slowed. Rebecca's sobs faded into background noise. David's mind raced. What would happen if he did this? If he ended it right now? Would it bring him peace? Or would it leave him with nothing but a deeper kind of emptiness? He stared at her, at the woman he had once loved more than anything. Now all he saw was a stranger. A killer. His breathing was ragged, his hands slick with sweat. He could do it. He should do it. But then, a sound. A voice. His own echoing in his head. You're not a killer, David. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His hands trembled. This wasn't him. He had never been a violent man. Never been someone who let rage consume him. Rebecca had destroyed his life. But if he pulled this trigger, he would destroy himself. David clenched his jaw. His whole body was shaking as he exhaled, long and heavy. Then, he lowered the gun. Rebecca let out a sob of relief, her hands covering her face. Oh my God, David. But he wasn't listening. His body felt drained, hollow, like all the anger had been sucked out of him, leaving only exhaustion behind. Without another word he turned. And walked away. The gun slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floor. Rebecca cried out, but he didn't look back. He just kept walking. Because this wasn't his burden to carry anymore. Rebecca had already sentenced him to death. But he wouldn't let her turn him into a murderer. Not tonight. Not ever. The night was heavy with silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind that brings comfort. This was the kind of silence that suffocates, that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. David stood in the kitchen, his hands trembling, his heart pounding so violently he could feel it in his throat. The revolver felt foreign in his grip, cold and unforgiving. Across from him, Rebecca stood frozen, her back pressed against the counter, her breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. Tears streamed down her face, but David didn't see sorrow in her eyes. Only fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. And yet, even now, even with a gun aimed at her, she didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't even try to justify what she had done. She just whispered, David, please? His mind was chaos. A storm of rage, betrayal, and heartbreak all crashing together at once. His wife. The woman he had devoted his life to. She had taken everything from him. His love. His trust. His future. And now, his life. The test results still sat on the counter, mocking him. Positive. HIV. The words echoed in his skull over and over again. David clenched his jaw, gripping the gun tighter. How could you do this to me? His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Rebecca let out a quiet sob. I didn't mean for this to happen. David let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. But it did. Her lip trembled. I was scared. Scared? His voice hardened. You weren't scared when you were in his bed, were you? Rebecca flinched. How many times, Rebecca? Silence. How many? He roared. She squeezed her eyes shut. Too many. His grip on the gun tightened. She had stolen everything from him, and now, in the end, all she could give him was a broken, whispered confession. Too many. His entire body trembled. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The weight of the gun in his hand. The way his finger hovered just above the trigger. One movement. One single pull. And it would all be over. His pain. His suffering. Her betrayal. Everything. The thought was intoxicating. For once he had control. For once he got to decide how this ended. Rebecca sobbed, shaking her head. David, please, don't do this. But hadn't she done this to him first? Hadn't she already killed him the moment she let another man touch her? The moment she brought home a sickness that would never leave his body? David's hands trembled. I loved you, he whispered. Rebecca let out a choked sob. I know. And this is how you repay me? She pressed her hands together as if in prayer. I made a mistake. David scoffed. A mistake? A mistake is forgetting our anniversary. A mistake is buying the wrong kind of coffee. You didn't make a mistake, Rebecca. You made a choice. Rebecca's breath hitched. David steadied his aim. In that moment, something inside him shifted. This was it. This was justice. The world had given him a death sentence, and now he was delivering one in return. His finger curled around the trigger. He inhaled. And then, a single gunshot shattered the silence. The sound echoed through the house, ringing in his ears, deafening. Rebecca gasped, her hands flying to her chest, her legs buckling beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor, her body jerking from the force of the bullet. Blood spread across her shirt, dark and unforgiving. David's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. The gun slipped from his fingers, clattering against the tile. Rebecca's lips parted, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with shock. She reached for him. David. His heart clenched. He had thought it would feel satisfying, that justice would taste sweet. But all he felt was empty. Rebecca's fingers twitched, then stilled. Her chest rose once, twice, then nothing. The woman he had once loved more than anything was gone. And he had pulled the trigger. The silence returned. But it was different now. Heavier. Final. David staggered back, pressing a shaking hand to his mouth. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't supposed to be his story. His vision blurred as he stumbled toward the kitchen table, his legs barely holding him up. What had he done? What had he become? The sound of sirens cut through the night. Someone must have heard the shot. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. David sank to his knees beside Rebecca's lifeless body. He had lost everything. But now, for the first time, he understood. He had lost himself too. The sirens grew louder. Flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of the house. A house that had once been filled with love, now stained with blood and regret. David sat motionless on the kitchen floor, his back pressed against the cabinets. The gun lay discarded beside him, its purpose fulfilled. And in front of him, Rebecca. So lifeless. A pool of crimson spread beneath her, seeping into the cracks of the cold tile. The woman he had once loved more than anything was gone. And he had been the one to end her. Time felt warped, stretched, and distorted. David could hear the distant sounds of voices, officers shouting, footsteps rushing up the porch, the crackle of a police radio. But none of it felt real. It was like he was watching someone else's life unfold, someone else's nightmare playing out in slow motion. Then, a sudden sharp voice. Sir, drop any weapons and put your hands in the air. David blinked. He turned his head sluggishly toward the front door, where two officers stood with their guns raised. The red and blue lights from the squad cars cast eerie shadows across the kitchen. David didn't resist. Didn't argue. Didn't move. Because what was there left to fight for? He slowly raised his hands, his arms heavy as if weighed down by the ghosts of every memory, every promise, every lie. An officer rushed forward, grabbing his wrist, forcing him onto his stomach. The cold steel of handcuffs locked around his wrists, biting into his skin. He barely felt it. Do you understand why you're being arrested? One of the officers asked, his voice sharp and professional. David swallowed, his throat dry. I killed her. The words were flat, emotionless. Because the truth was he had died along with her. The next few hours passed in a blur. The police station. The sterile walls. The endless questions. Was there an argument? Did she threaten you? Was this premeditated? David gave them the same answer over and over again. She betrayed me. Some officers looked at him with disgust. Others with pity. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered. By the time his lawyer arrived, David was sitting in a small, windowless interrogation room, staring blankly at the table. David, listen to me, the lawyer said, his voice urgent. We need to build your defense. You can claim temporary insanity. David shook his head. No. David. I don't want a defense. The lawyer exhaled sharply. If you plead guilty, they'll give you life in prison. David nodded slowly. I know. Because what kind of life did he have left? News of Rebecca's murder spread quickly. The story was everywhere, on the news, in the papers, on social media. Betrayal turns deadly. Husband kills wife in shocking crime of passion. A marriage built on lies ends in bloodshed. HIV diagnosis led husband to commit unthinkable act. People whispered. Some called him a monster. Others called him a victim. The truth was he was both. His trial came months later. By then David had lost count of the days. Each morning was the same. Wake up in a cold, gray cell, eat food that had no taste, listen to the echoes of other prisoners in the hallways. But the trial forced him back into the real world. Forced him to face the consequences of what he had done. Rebecca's family was in the courtroom. Her mother wept. Her father glared at him with eyes full of hate. And then there was him. The man she had slept with. The man who had infected her, who had unknowingly sealed David's fate. He sat quietly in the courtroom, expression unreadable. David wondered if he felt guilt. If he even cared. It didn't matter. Because in the end, David had pulled the trigger. The judge read his sentence. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. The weight of those words settled over him like a final nail in the coffin. As David was led away, he didn't look at Rebecca's family. Didn't look at anyone. There was no point. His fate was sealed. His story had already been written. But as he stepped into the prison transport van, something gnawed at the back of his mind. The real punishment wasn't the prison walls. Or the years he would spend behind bars. The real punishment was living with what he had done. Living with the fact that he had let rage consume him. Living with the knowledge that no matter how much he hated Rebecca for what she had done, he had become something far worse. A killer. And that was a price he would pay for the rest of his life. Betrayal. Rage. Regret. It all came down to this. A love story that had begun with promise, with vows of forever, had ended in blood and destruction. David had once believed in loyalty, in trust, in the idea that marriage was unbreakable. But in the end he had learned the harshest truth of all. Love does not always protect you. Sometimes it destroys you. Rebecca's betrayal had shattered him, left him with an irreversible sentence. But in a moment of blind fury, he had sealed his own fate. Now, as the days in prison stretched into years, David was left with nothing but time. Time to think. Time to regret. Time to relive that single moment over and over again, wondering, was there another way? Was there a version of this story where he had walked away instead of pulling the trigger? Where he had chosen life over revenge? But that version of David no longer existed. He had died the moment he let anger take control. The world outside moved on without him. News headlines faded. The whispers died down. People found new stories to talk about, new tragedies to obsess over. Rebecca was gone. David was forgotten. But the echoes of their choices would never truly disappear. A single moment. A single decision. That was all it took to change everything. If there was one lesson to be learned from this tragedy, it was this. Betrayal has a price. And sometimes the cost is far greater than you ever imagined. At the Family Crime Exposed, we bring you true crime stories that unfold behind closed doors, where love turns to deception and trust ends in tragedy. Performing arts, suspense, thrill, truth. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe now and dive into real-life family crime stories that will leave you speechless. Pushpin like, comment, and share to help uncover the truth behind these chilling cases.